Adjunct there.
Adjunct.
Yeah.
Fencing coach?
Privately.
Privately.
That's my
Got
first
it.
job.
Okay. His research on time and timekeeping will be published by Johns Hopkins University Press. His numerous other publications tend to center around fencing.
Cool. Thank you very much, Adam. So, imagine taking a stroll through the cramped, zigzagging streets of medieval Paris. Actually, I might as well keep us on that map. Think of how different it is from the modern city. Automobiles and bicycles replaced by horses, the muddy streets paved with planks rather than cobblestones, the merchants beginning to shutter the open front shops that occupy the ground floors of their half-timbered houses. Consider the crowding. Paris was a town of perhaps 250,000 souls crammed into a space the size of a medium-sized college campus. Think of the different smells, the aromas of cooking dinner, wood smoke, incense, and perfumes mixed with the odor of unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, and human and animal waste. Then imagine the sounds, not just conversations in almost familiar French, the clip-clop of hooves and snatches of laughter and song coming from open tavern doors, but also the sound of church bells ringing in a complicated code that the people of Paris knew how to interpret as a language unto itself. For instance, though the echoes of the bells of Notre Dame ringing vespers might have already been fading into the dusk, the leatherworkers' apprentices, as per the rules of their guild, could not quit work and close their shops until the rector of the parish church rang his own bell. However, their fellow apprentices in the mailmaker shops, dependent on their master's whims and not the bell system, would continue to work by candlelight, glumly piercing rivet holes in the ends of the curled and flattened pieces of iron wire that will be linked together into armor for the knights of the royal court. Meanwhile, the professors in the University of Paris listened for the bells of Saint Jacques or the Carmelite monks down there, sounding their evening prayers to know when to stop lecturing. Churches were the foremost amongst the signs medieval people looked to in order to navigate their path through time and space. Not only the monolithic churches and institution, but also the individual parish churches that they interacted with on a daily basis. Rather than relying on posted street names as we do today, one means of navigating through the cramped alleyways was to cite the various bell towers over the roofs of the wood-frame buildings. Similarly, one might identify one's dwelling place to a notary or official by using the local parish church as a convenient landmark. Besides their use as spiritual and geographical signposts, these church steeples also acted as time markers. In addition to indicators of natural time, such as the passage of the sun through the sky, the rhythm of daily life is regulated by the ringing of their bells. Everything from the bustling marketplace to working hours was measured by these signals. For the student, it was the signal that he was late to class. For the worker, it was the cue to begin her daily labors. For the monk or nun, it was a summons to divine service. As alien as the bell system may seem to our eyes and ears, it was a system of telling time no less systemic than our modern atomic synchronized clocks, for it accomplished one of the major purposes for which we use timekeeping. It successfully achieved the purpose of social coordination. Guillaume Durand, in his explanation of the divine office, circa 1290s, specifies the 6 types of bells used in a church. The squilla, handbell, the cymbalum in the refectory, the nola in the cloister, the nolula or double campana in the clock, the signum in the tower, and the campana in the bell tower. He also specifies that bells were to be rung 12 times a day, one for prime, thrice for tierce, sexton none, and multiple times for vesper and matins. Besides being a call to prayer, bells were a universally recognized symbol of danger, the air raid klaxon of the Middle Ages. For instance, in the spring of 1278, when some of the students and teachers of the university came into the fields outside of Paris for the cause of recreation, Gerard, the abbot of the nearby monastery of Saint-Germain, actually I've got a map to show you where everything is in Paris. Where are we? Here we are. So here's the university, right? Here's Saint-Germain. Had his bells rung to assemble his private army, and with cries of kill the clerks, kill them, they sat upon the hapless scholars, causing them to flee to the safety of the city. They also rang for other events such as a death, a procession, or a coronation. They could produce a variety of tones, such as being tolled rather than rung in Lent. Finally, bells were symbolic of the city itself. An example, in March of 1331, King Philip VI abolished the city government of Lyon in response to a rebellion and ordered that the bells of that city be seized and taken from their towers, never to be returned. Only 2 were to remain, a large one to sound curfew, daybreak, and signal the town guard to assemble in its accustomed place, and a small one to sound a bit before the large one, the pre-signal or clinket, a common ringing practice, and to be rung together with it in cases of fire. The action speaks not only to the practical utility of such bells, but also to their social meaning. The bells were identified with the city, and to remove them was a symbolic decapitation of the community, a removal of the right to self-government, and to constitute their own rules. While antiquarians may be able to reconstruct the physical map of Paris as it was in the days of St. Louis or Philip the Fair, the landscape of sonic chronography, the acoustic environment, as Doris Stockman put it, the acoustic Umwelt, remains little studied. Yet, haphazard as it may seem to our eyes, it was a system of telling time no less systemic than satellite synchronized clocks. However, to understand the system, we must first understand its context. Further, considering that timekeeping was socially dependent, it stands to reason that different groups would have utilized time signaling in different fashions, both to be more or less cognizant of it, and to use it to structure their activities to a greater or lesser degree. I'm going to talk today about how three groups made use of time signals and conceptions of time: the royal administration, the bourgeoisie, and most of all the university, and how this changed from the 13th to the 14th century, around the time of the introduction of the all-mechanical clock, which is to say the Virgin Foliot mechanism. To begin with the royal administration, the most persistent myth relating to time signaling in Paris is the provenance of the information about Charles V's three striking bells at Vincennes, St. Paul, and the Royal Palace circa 1370. The Royal Palace, of course, right here. Not far from Notre Dame, let's say about maybe 200 meters from Notre Dame, on the Ile de la Cité. Though this was not the first clock in Paris, the Confraternity of Saint-Jacques built a clock with automata down by the southern gates of the city on the Rue Saint-Jacques in the 1320s. This clock has become sort of the emblematic just so story that reduces historical processes to single heroic incidents. The ultimate source of this information was a 1372 French translation of Durand's explanation made by the Carmelite monk and theologian Jean Gaulin, and we'll see the Carmelites up again in a moment, in which the translator both updates the text and compliments his patron by mentioning Charles's three clocks. Here is the actual excerpt, my translation. And this is in three, without getting into details, these are three very sumptuous manuscripts. So on page 13 verso, manuscript Bibliothèque Nationale Française, 176, and 17 verso Français 931, we read, voila, not gonna read it here. Basically, he puts in that how Charles puts in these clocks and how they sounded by points so that they can have certain knowledge of the hours by means of these well-adjusted clocks. So we have here a wealth of timekeeping information. Not only Charles' innovation, but also the explicit association of keeping track of the stars, because of course ultimately timekeeping was astronomically based, timekeeping and kingly wisdom, the fact that foreign specialized labor was brought in to construct the clock, and the idea that human activity, both clerical and lay, should be regulated by these devices. Whether this was actually so, we'll see in a moment. The use of this clock is corroborated by the Châtelet regulation passed by Hugh Aubrey, who's provost from 1367 to 1386, which demanded that the judges had to be in their seats from 9 o'clock according to the palace clock or thereabouts, to noon between October 1st, that is the feast day of St. Remigius, and Easter, and from 8 to 11 from Easter to St. Remigius. So basically, they had daylight savings, right? Conversely, a 1320 regulation of the Parlement of Paris established simply that the meeting of the clergy, notaries, and bourgeois would begin by the bell of the Sainte-Chapelle, and that the midday bell, until no one was to leave unless it was absolutely necessary. So, how did this palace public clock actually affect Parisians' mental constructions? Was it as a big deal as Jean Gaulin made it out to be? The Criminal Register of the Châtelet from 1389 to 1392 was published in 2 volumes by Henri Duplay-Angier in 1861 and 1864, and it gives us a little taste of what we can find. So, only looking at the first volume, about 50 references to the hour, if we count 4 respondents saying that they didn't know the hour, and mind you, of course, these confessions are beaten out of them, so they might or might not more reflect what the people at the Châtelet were thinking than what the actual perpetrators were thinking. So 21 mention activities taking place around canonical hours. One in the village mentions known, which was disappeared in Paris in favor of a midday lunch bell. 3 mention midi, or the hour after. 8 mentioning dinner time, dîner, which would be the afternoon meal, or around an hour thereafter. And 2 mention 8 hours in the night when bells would have rung for compline. This matches the findings of Claude Gavard's much more comprehensive survey of letters of remission, in which she talks about, she looks at, well, just all aspects of everything you can kind of glean from these letters of remission. She found in 35% of the cases, they specify some sort of hour, which is divided into several categories. Clock time, which is only 14.5% of cases. Folkloric, such as expressions such as entre chien et loup, when you can't tell the difference between a dog and a wolf in the street. Elementary, like meaning lunchtime. Solar, meaning sunrise and sunset. And 13.5 have multiple or other. Use of time, though, is not what you would expect between classes of people. Clerics were less likely to use clock time than guild members were, officers, or laborers. 1.1% compared to 7% for guild members, 4.5% for officers, and 3% for laborers. So, in other words, the clerics are even less cognizant of clock time. Clerics, however, were more likely to use ecclesiastical or folkloric time, 16.3% each, as compared to 8.5% for officers and much less for everybody else. As we might expect, the use of clock time, though, increased as time went on, 5% under Charles VI, 11% under Louis XI. Gavard also notes that measures of duration such as the half hour, quarter hour, and half quarter hour, Charles V's points, gain currency, as these would have been sounded as well. Going to the conclusion from this evidence that despite the use of public clocks for 2 decades previous to these proceedings, the use of public time signals in the law courts and the popular mindset remained for the most part eminently traditional well into the 15th century. There were other 14th century royal regulations regarding bell signals, such as Philip VI granting the citizens of Amiens the right to ring bells to signal start and stop of the workday in 1335, John II regulating Parisian grain markets by canonical hours in 1351, 1361 giving orders to the cloth workers of Keene who worked before the morning bell or the evening bell, and Charles V upholding similar statutes for Tournai in 1365 and Douai in 1368. So, given the customary nature of royal authority and well-established system of privileges, whether or not the king actually had the authority to regulate Paris, and especially the Rive Gauche, where the university was, is quite debatable. So, let's move on to work time. Parisian workers' regulations in the Livre de Métier of Etienne Boileau, published for a long time by L'Espinasse, give us a really, really good regulation. So, essentially, in 16 of these, you have specific hours after which no work can be done. So this is going back to the 13th century, right? Usually it is ecclesiastical. Also, other things are curfew, coverfew, which is the evening, cockcrows, criers, having to light candles in the beginning and ending at bien jour, broad daylight, and there you go. So a lot of these are auditory signals, and some are visual signals, such as it being light out. But interestingly, they're much more interested in the auditory signals for a lot. And these traditional measures continued through the 14th century after the introduction of the mechanical clock. The first mention of clock time relating to Parisian guilds is not until 1384, when the cloth cutters are actually going by the are actually mentioning the hours, and the palace clock is only mentioned in the 1415 regulation of the cloth cutters. Moreover, the regular work hour was not implemented evenly, and the canonical hours continued to be used alongside clock time. In fact, a 1382 regulation of the tinsmiths forbade work on Saturday after Vespers was sounded in the parish where they lived, or on the Palais, so they used multiple signals. In sum, time work regulations made in Paris tended towards conservatism and preferred the way that things were done. So here's some of the things that they had to do. And they also use this multiplicity of signals that they only some of the regulations mention, like 60 odd, mention specific churches. But what I want to point out also is that, yeah, one mentions St. Martin de Champs, which is all the way up there, like, north of the Marais now. But three of the ones that they mention are really close together. I mean, these are like, within stone's throw. There's St. Opportune, that's St. Innocent, there's St. Marie, all really, really close together. And so they're clearly looking to a church that is meaningful to them as a community. They're listening to the time signal, and that a certain sound is certain bell. They can tell the difference between the bells, and that is significant to them as a community. They're constituting the communities around this. So speaking of communities, let's look at the University of Paris. That the university was, I had a graph, I'm sorry. Anyway, out of 101, right, here you can get an idea of how many each are. I knew I had a graph in there somewhere. So, that the University of Paris was subject to tight temporal regulation should be no surprise to modern academics. Much as today, running the university required a great deal of social coordination, such as the scheduling and duration of faculty meetings, probably the most important thing that one does, examinations, and determining the length of lectures, to which problems were added, particularly medieval concerns such as holding common prayer and disputations. Moreover, regulations had to specify which signals from which bells should be heeded. Beginning with the most obvious function of the university, the time of lectures had been coordinated almost from the university's inception. In 1231, Gregory IX confirmed statutes that included the hours of lectures. This went for the mendicant orders as well. Dominicans assigned to lectures were ordered by the Captain General of the Orders in 1240 to hold them until compline on ordinary days and known on holidays, as noon. In 1244, a regulation was passed that no one was to lecture until Tierce from the feast of St. Remigius till Lent, and that in Lent it was after examinations for bachelor's degrees up to Easter, no one should lecture until compline was over, no one should give extraordinary lectures before Tierce in Lent when the masters debated, etc., etc., etc. I could go and list them all, but in short, the scholars had a lot of bells to listen for. Academic discipline required that these statutes be periodically reaffirmed, such as in 1275, reminding that lectures were to be given at the proper times and in the proper dress. No slacking, no polo shirts. The need for this regulation persisted well into the era when clocks became common, as we can see from this regulation from 1347 from the Nation of the Picards, passed on December 22nd at the meeting held at Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre, which, besides mentioning pecuniary matters, tries to make sense of these which bells should be heeded, right? So, insomuch that noise not uniformly sounded in the cathedral, that no one should bring vespers unless you listen to the cathedral, and that also that there should be a sermon, and that this should be rung with 3 signals. So actually, how you're actually going to ring these, and it's concerned for time and the spacing of these things. So again, affecting this acoustic landscape. This had already been established by the nation of the Normans in an Act of 1337. Because the University of Paris is divided into different nations, right? Different, essentially, colleges. So similarly, in 1367. We get this. This is really, 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 really specific as to which ones you should listen to. Again, this is the Picards. This is the Faculty of Arts. I'm sorry, this is the Faculty of Arts, saying that you should very, very. They're meeting Saint Matherin, and they're saying that these are the bells that you should listen for. This is, of course, the Jacobins, right, where we know there's a clock, right, with automata. And then there's the Carmelites. And, of course, Jean Gaulin, who, wrote that thing in praise of the clock up at the Palais, and there's, of course, Notre Dame, was a Carmelite. So, obviously, the Carmelites were maybe a little clock-obsessed. And then here's the Matherin and Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre. So, I mean, these churches are still pretty much there. You can go and tour the Rue Gauche, and then here's where I used to fence right there. That wasn't there then. That wasn't until. So, owing to accidents of survival and vagaries of published sources, it is difficult to get an accurate census of how many acts contain time indications, but lawsuits, like the one in 1330-31 between the faculties of medicine and chancellor of the university, concerning the right to bestow degrees provides us with some insight. So of 25 acts, 8 or about a quarter mention time in terms of the liturgical hour. All of these are from the 15 initiated by the faculty of medicine or resulting settlement, and also mentions the hour. As numerous statutes also attest, members and masters of the nations were also required to worship together at appointed times under penalty of a monetary fine. Exam times and the times of the inception disputations known as Vespers were similarly tied to the round of liturgical worship. While ideas of the proper keeping of time were important to the university throughout its history, the discourse on time did not maintain stable for the roughly 100 years plus 150 years over which I'm covering, from the mid to late 13th century into the mid to late 14th century. Rather, we can perhaps identify certain changes and shifts in how the university regulated itself, concomitant with the development of timekeeping technology. In the 13th century, we see a great emphasis on time signals such as bells ringing preem and the weight and dimensions of candles for measuring, for instance, meetings for electing a rector. That's a different paper. Scholars of the 13th century also tended to, in their philosophy, deal with time in the abstract Aristotelian sense of only being measurable in proportion to tangible things. However, with increasingly sophisticated clock technology becoming more and more available, and the building of horological automata, such as the sounding clock at St. Jacques, we see more and more concern for temporal regulation for the academic generation that came of age in the 1320s and 1330s. That it also, similarly, the generation of Jean Buridan in their philosophy show the desire for constancy and to tie timekeeping, that is astronomical timekeeping, to a definite thing, that is the outermost heavenly sphere, and the desire to regulate life according to some rational scheme, but hesitancy about the means to use and the feasibility of the project. The final phase or tendency is the generation of Nicolas Rem and Charles V, when the clocks begin to be truly accepted, and they are really into listening for the bells that we know, like Saint Jacques. Well, they have there's a sounding bell. The liturgical times are still being used, but they're now tied to a signal we know is controlled by a clock. A change of mentality must have occurred, I would argue, over the intervening decades to make this time indication admissible and even primary. The university taught the astronomy by which the clocks was regulated, guarded the idea of the absolute hour, nurtured abstract thought on time, and trained the clerics who controlled the bells that guided the workers and who kept records and became royal advisors. So while Doran van Rossum who disagrees with me on this, and is probably right, by the way, I'm probably wrong with this, is correct in saying that the university adhered to the customary traditional liturgical times well after clock time had become widely adopted. Parisian scholars by no means unconscious of the possibility of the latter. Rather, they were as up to date on the possibilities of advancing technology, or perhaps even more so than their contemporaries. Moreover, members of universities from the 1380s on began to regulate themselves by bells sounded by clocks. In this, there is somewhat prescient for most quotidian uses, especially public time signaling. The sonic landscape of the liturgical hours continued to be alongside, and for most applications was more important than clock time, or I should say rather, bells rung by clocks, well into the 15th century. That's roughly 20 minutes. All right, thank you.